If you stand on the edge of that crumbling concrete today, with the Pacific wind knifing through your jacket and the fog rolling in like something alive, it's hard to imagine that this was once the pride of San Francisco. You see broken stairways leading nowhere, rusted railings jutting out of pools filled with seawater and algae, and waves pounding against what looks like the bones of some extinct beast. People pick their way along the ruins with coffee cups and cameras. Teenagers balance on old walls for a better selfie, and somewhere a gull screams overhead. Most of them have no idea that they're walking through the ghost of a dream so big and so strange that it almost bankrupted a millionaire, changed a city's idea of who deserved luxury, and ended in fire so suspicious that people are still arguing about it. They just know this place feels haunted. Not just by death, although there's plenty of that in the story, but by ambition. By a time when one man thought he could trap the Pacific Ocean in a giant glass palace and turn the rough waves and cold fog into a playground for everyone. This is the story of the Sutro Baths. But underneath that, it's the story of how far one city will go to entertain itself, who gets invited into the party, and what happens when the bill comes due. Because behind the bright postcards and the flashy statistics about the world's largest indoor swimming complex, there are darker chapters. Workers maimed, kids who never came home, suspicious deals, and a mysterious blaze that finished off what time and neglect had already started to kill. So let's walk back from the edge of the ruins for a second. Imagine the fog thinning, the concrete skeleton knitting itself back together. Hear hammers, whistles, the hiss of steam. Smell fresh-cut wood and hot grease and chlorine and seawater all blending together. The ghost of this place wants to be remembered properly, so we'll let it rebuild in our minds. To really understand why these baths existed at all, we have to go back before the pools, before the huge glass roof, before the crowds, back to a San Francisco that was still half mud, half miracle, and to a young immigrant who looked at the chaos and saw a staircase to the kind of wealth that could buy anything, even his own private corner of the Pacific. His name was Adolph Sutro. He didn't come from old money. There was no family crest, no ancient estate back in Europe. He was born in Prussia, the son of a modest merchant, and like so many people in the mid-19th century, he fixed his eyes on America as the place where the rules were looser and the ceilings were higher. He arrived in the United States in the middle of the gold rush frenzy, when San Francisco was still a muddy boomtown where fortunes were being made and lost overnight. By the time he really began to matter to our story, gold was yesterday's news, and the big game was silver. In the mountains of Nevada, the Comstock lode was coughing up unimaginable amounts of silver, but at a terrible price. Mines flooded constantly, temperatures underground were infernal, and ventilation was a nightmare. Dozens of men died in explosions or cave-ins, and hundreds more were slowly cooked in the heat and dust. Sutro was not a miner. He was an engineer with a talent for seeing systems where other men saw only chaos. His plan was as audacious as it was simple to describe. Dig a massive drainage and ventilation tunnel straight through the mountain, undercutting the Comstock mines, so that water could be pumped out and fresh air could flow in. It was the kind of scheme that would either make him famous and rich, or bury him in debt and rock. It took years, lawsuits, fights with the mine owners who hated the idea of paying someone else to fix their problems. At one point, it probably felt like the mountain itself was trying to spit him out. But the Sutro Tunnel finally became a reality, and with it came the money. Not the quiet, respectable money of a doctor or a lawyer, but the wild, boomtown money of the West, enough to buy land, enough to build monuments. And that's exactly what he did. Adolph Sutro looked west, to the edge of San Francisco, where the city dissolved into sand dunes and cliffs, and the Pacific crashed against rocks with a constant roar. Most people saw danger and emptiness out there. Sutro saw opportunity. He began buying up land at Land's End, the far northwestern corner of the peninsula. On one of those cliffs, he built his own estate, Sutro Heights, a kind of clifftop fantasy filled with manicured gardens, classical statues, and winding paths. It was a private residence, yes, but he opened the grounds to the public. People could stroll the terraces, gaze out at the ocean, and pretend for a moment that this was Europe, if Europe had foghorns. Below his estate, perched on another cliff, stood the Cliff House, a restaurant and resort that had already gone through one or two incarnations by the time Sutro got involved. He eventually acquired that too and rebuilt it as a sort of postcard castle, all turrets and gingerbread, clinging to the rock above the waves. If you were wealthy in San Francisco in the 1890s, you would come here to dine with a view that made your guests gasp. If you were less wealthy, you might ride out just to stand and look, imagining what it would be like to eat in such a place. And down below, between the cliffs, there was a small, rocky cove where the ocean surged in and out, steep, dangerous, icy cold. The Pacific off San Francisco is not friendly swimming water. The currents are strong, the waves deceptive, the temperature bone-deep cold for most of the year. People had drowned here. People drowned all along Ocean Beach, chasing a romantic idea of bathing in the sea that the local climate didn't really support. This is where Sutro's next idea took root. What if you could bring the Pacific to the people? Without the danger, what if you could offer the working class the same kind of bathing luxury that rich Europeans enjoyed at their seaside spas and hotel resorts, but at a price a laborer or shop clerk could afford? Now, it's important to understand something here. Sutro was not a purely altruistic philanthropist. He wanted to do good, sure, but he also wanted to build things that made people say his name with a certain tone. He wanted monuments, and he knew a spectacle when he saw one. A gigantic glass-covered natatorium filled with seawater, wedged into the cliffs under his estate and beside his restaurant. That was spectacle. So the idea of the Sutro Baths was born. A massive indoor complex of pools filled with Pacific Ocean water, heated and filtered, surrounded by bleachers, exhibits, and concessions, big enough to hold thousands of people at once. The engineering challenge was insane. They wanted to use the force of the tides to help fill the pools. That meant designing a system that could pull cold, pounding surf into a set of basins without shredding the infrastructure or turning the whole thing into a death trap. The building extended out over what had once been open water at high tide. It would need foundations sunk deep into the rock and walls strong enough to take the constant vibration of waves. San Francisco's weather added another layer: wind, salt air, fog, and the ever-present possibility of earthquakes. Construction began in the 1890s. Over time, the simple idea of an indoor pool grew into something more like an aquatic cathedral. The final structure had a huge glass and steel superstructure, like a greenhouse on steroids, towering over the tiers of swimming pools. Inside, the light on a clear afternoon would have been almost blinding, bouncing off the water and the white-painted rails and stairs. On a foggy day, the whole interior would glow softly, the world outside vanishing into gray. There were multiple pools, 7 is the number often repeated, each at a different temperature, some cooled directly by the ocean, some warmed by boilers. There were shallow pools for children, deeper ones for strong swimmers, a plunge where thrill-seekers could dive from platforms into cold water. There were slides, trapezes, springboards. The complex was designed to accommodate more than 10,000 people at once, both swimmers and spectators, who could sit on bleachers and watch the action below. The pools themselves were a constantly circulating system. At high tide, valves were opened and Pacific water rushed in to flush out the old and fill the new. Massive pumps and filters worked to keep things at least reasonably clean, though the idea of water hygiene at the time was very different from today's chlorine-heavy standards. It was the ocean, tamed but not entirely domestic. Around the water, Sutro created something like a museum and fairground combined. There were exhibits of taxidermied animals, artwork, oddities collected from around the world. There were concessions selling food and drinks, places to rent bathing suits and towels, rooms for band concerts. You could spend an entire day there without ever getting wet if you preferred just to wander, watch, and marvel. And the price of admission? Ridiculously low by design. Sutro wanted this to be a place for everyone. He fought bitterly with the Southern Pacific Railroad to ensure that streetcar and rail fares to his baths were kept cheap enough that ordinary San Franciscans could afford the journey. In the process, he became something of a populist hero, framed in the papers as the man taking on the railroad barons for the sake of the people's pleasures. But every ticket sold for a few cents meant that the math behind the scenes had to work perfectly. Boilers, Pumps, maintenance crews, lifeguards, cleaners, managers. This place burned money. It was like owning a pet volcano, spectacular, impressive, and always hungry. When the baths finally opened in 1896, they were hailed as a marvel. People poured in by the thousands. Imagine being a factory worker or dock laborer who'd never owned a bathtub, stepping into this glittering glass hall filled with clear blue water. The echo of laughter and splashing, brass band music in the background, the smell of popcorn and seawater. Imagine the shock of cold Pacific rushing over your shoulders, but contained in a safe pool with lifeguards watching, your children shrieking nearby. There was a moral angle to it as well. In an era obsessed with hygiene and improving the working class, public bathing was seen as wholesome, almost virtuous. The baths were advertised not just as fun but as healthful. Fresh ocean water, cleanliness, exercise. Of course, it wasn't that simple. Even in this palace for the people, class and respectability rules followed you right into the pool. Men and women swam separately at certain times. Bathing suits had to meet modesty standards. And although in theory the baths were open to everyone, social realities meant that not all races and ethnicities were treated equally. Stories survive of people of color being treated coldly, ignored, or subtly discouraged. It's hard to imagine that in a city where anti-Chinese sentiment was literally written into law at times, the baths were some magically pure egalitarian space. And then there were the accidents. Whenever you combine water, heights, crowds, and imperfect safety standards, things go wrong. People slipped from wet catwalks. Kids got in over their heads, sometimes literally. There were drownings. Not dozens every week, but enough to stain the place's history, enough to send families home in carriages with one child fewer than they arrived with. On the cliffs nearby, suicides had already been a grim part of local lore. The dramatic drop from rock to waves appealed to those who wanted a final, theatrical exit. The baths almost certainly gained their own share of dark stories, someone disappearing into deep water, or using the roar of the crowd to mask a quiet, final decision. On top of all that, the water wasn't always as clean as the advertisements promised. This was still Victorian and early 20th century San Francisco, with questionable sewage treatment practices. Ocean water near the city could be polluted. If the tides weren't right or the pumps were failing, the pools could get murky, cloudy, smelling more of humanity than of the bracing sea. There were concerns about disease, about skin infections, about the baths turning from a temple of hygiene into a petri dish. Behind the scenes, workers labored in hot, damp, and dangerous conditions, keeping boilers running, clearing clogged pipes, dealing with rusting metal in air thick with salt and steam was no glamorous job. In the age before modern worker protections, injuries were common. A slip near a pump, a hand caught in a moving belt, a fall onto concrete, these stories rarely made the front page, but they added up to a quiet human cost. Still, for a while, the vision worked. The baths were an essential part of San Francisco's identity. They appeared on postcards, in travel guides, in the routines of families who would save up for a Sunday outing by the sea. Sutro himself rode that wave of popularity, literally and figuratively, all the way into politics. He became mayor of San Francisco in the 1890s, his populist reputation boosted by his battles with the railroads and his creation of public attractions. But the city was changing fast, and so was the world. Even before the great earthquake of 1906, the costs of maintaining the baths were biting. The structure was built in an era of cheap labor and cheaper optimism. The reality of corrosion, wear and tear, and technological obsolescence came later. Then came the quake. When the ground ripped apart in April 1906 and firestorms consumed most of downtown, the Cliff House and Sutro's domain out at Land's End were not at the epicenter of destruction, but they were not untouched. The Cliff House was heavily damaged and would be rebuilt yet again in simpler form. The baths survived structurally, but the city they served was traumatized. In the aftermath, with so much of San Francisco in ruins, the baths became a kind of escape hatch. People who'd lost homes and businesses could still, if they had a little money to spare, go out to the edge of the continent and immerse themselves in something that felt normal, almost utopian, at least for a while. Adolph Sutro didn't live to see the long, slow decline of his aquatic palace. He died in 1898, leaving his vast holdings, including the baths, to his heirs. And here the story tilts. Because it's one thing to build a monument when you have a singular vision. It's another thing to keep it alive when it's handed down like a problem as much as a treasure. The Sutro family had land, structures, and name recognition, but they also had this gigantic, expensive, rusting machine by the sea that demanded constant care. As the decades rolled on, tastes changed. Swimming remained popular, but other forms of entertainment were catching people's eyes and wallets. Motion pictures, ball games, new amusement parks like Playland at the beach just down the shore. The Baths tried to adapt. They added a skating rink at one point, transforming one of the pool areas into a floor for roller skating or ice skating, depending on the incarnation. They hosted beauty contests, diving exhibitions, carnival-style acts. The taxidermy exhibits and museum curiosities grew more eccentric, a way of padding out the attraction without having to rebuild the core structure. But the building itself, that massive glass and steel shell, was aging. Imagine decades of salt air grinding away at every bolt and beam. Glass panes cracked or broken by storms were replaced, but never as quickly or thoroughly as in the early years. Paint peeled, rust crept, leaks formed in the roof. When it rained, certain areas might become off-limits or comically wet. The baths still looked impressive from a distance, all that glass and volume, but close up, the gloss was fading. Economically, it was a trap. The cheaper they made admission to attract more people, the less money they had to reinvest. Raising prices risked driving away the very working-class patrons that had justified the whole enterprise. And as private swimming pools, neighborhood bathhouses, and simpler municipal pools opened closer to where people lived, the idea of making the long trip out to the ocean for a swim lost some of its shine. The Great Depression slammed into this already precarious balance. Suddenly, entertainment budgets in working homes evaporated. Even a few cents for a streetcar ride and a dip in a chilly pool became a luxury. The baths limped through the 1930s, relying more and more on novelty attractions and special events to survive. There were stories of desperate attempts to cut costs, from staff reductions to delayed maintenance. Nothing kills a complex machine faster than neglect, and the baths were nothing if not a complex machine. During World War II, with the West Coast haunted by the fear of attack, the area around Land's End took on a different tone. Military installations dotted the cliffs. The baths kept operating, but the mood was different. Young men who used to splash in the pools in silly horseplay now appeared in uniform, marching past on their way to real battles. There's something eerie about imagining that huge glass shell glowing faintly under blackout regulations. A big, vulnerable shape on a coast, suddenly obsessed with defense. After the war, America changed again, dramatically. Car culture exploded. People moved to the suburbs. New, modern recreation options popped up. Bowling alleys, drive-in theaters, enclosed shopping centers with air conditioning. At the same time, the ideal of indoor swimming shifted toward clean, rectangular chlorinated pools, often connected to schools, gyms, or suburban communities. The Sutro Baths, by comparison, began to feel old. Not old in the charming way of a preserved historic building, but old like a piece of machinery just on the edge of failure. The grand glass roof, once a symbol of modernity, now looked like something from a bygone industrial age. The odd combination of museum, baths, and carnival started to feel unfocused compared to the sleek, specialized entertainment venues popping up elsewhere. By the 1950s, visiting the baths could be an odd experience. On some days, you'd still find crowds, families taking advantage of a rare sunny weekend, kids daring each other to jump from the higher platforms, teenagers showing off. On others, the echo of your footsteps would overpower the sound of water. Lifeguards watched nearly empty pools. Concession stands stood half-shuttered. The drafty corners of the building grew cold and damp, filled with peeling posters and forgotten exhibition cases. To some people, that emptiness was part of the allure. There's a certain type of person drawn to fading grandeur, to places that feel like they've already begun rehearsing for their own afterlife. You can imagine the teenagers who came here on dates, wandering the dimmer corners, the mood oscillating between romance and unease. The tunnels under the baths, the catacombs and old machinery rooms became the stuff of whispered stories, ghost tales. I heard a kid drowned here once and now you can hear him splashing after closing. That kind of thing. Crime and petty mischief crept in around the edges. A building that large with that many hidden nooks is hard to police. Vandalism, minor theft, trespassing after hours, none of it surprising. And the sea outside didn't grow any kinder. Even if you never set foot in the pools, the cliffs and rocks around the baths claimed lives with grim regularity. Hikers slipping on wet stone, people swept off by rogue waves, suicides climbing fences in moments of despair. From the perspective of the accountants and owners, the baths were becoming indefensible. They were a safety liability. The insurance costs alone must have been terrifying. And then there was the elephant in the room, land value. The northwestern edge of San Francisco, once a windswept outpost, was now a desirable area. The ground that the baths sat on was worth a fortune, maybe more as a blank slate than as a decaying curiosity. In the early 1960s, the inevitable conversations began in earnest. What if we tore this thing down? What if instead of spending a fortune to try to modernize an earthquake-proof and aging glass and steel behemoth, we just started over? High-rise apartments were one plan that surfaced. A new, modern development with sweeping ocean views, the kind of thing that would sell instantly to people dreaming of breakfast with the Pacific right outside their windows. On paper, it made brutal economic sense. For preservationists, romantics, and anyone who believed that cities should keep more than a handful of their old, eccentric self, it felt like a gut punch. But the preservation movement in America was just beginning to gather real strength. There weren't yet the laws and processes in place that might have saved the baths if they'd been born a few decades later. At that moment, they were just an old money-losing building standing on prime real estate. The decision was made. The Sutro Baths would be closed and demolished. When the doors finally shut to the public in the mid-1960s, people took their last looks in many different moods. Some came to say goodbye to a place that had been part of their childhoods. They remembered the shock of cold water, the smell of the place, the way the light came through the roof on foggy days like heaven trying to get in. Others came out of curiosity, wanting to see this dinosaur one last time before it vanished. Inside, as demolition preparations began, the baths must have felt stranger than ever. Exhibits removed, glass panes taken down, machinery shut off for good. The pools, emptied or left stagnant, no longer spaces for play but just holes in the ground. The quiet would have been overwhelming. A building that had lived on sound, splashing, shouting, music, suddenly reduced to echoes of footsteps and the moan of the sea outside. And then, in 1966, came the fire. If you ask 10 people who lived through that time in San Francisco what they think caused the blaze that finally gutted the Sutro Baths, you'll get 10 variations. Officially, sure, there were explanations, but unofficially, the rumors have always been louder than the reports. The fire broke out while the structure was in the process of being dismantled. That alone is suspicious timing. A building being prepped for demolition suddenly goes up in flames before the wrecking ball finishes the job. Photographs from that day show massive columns of black smoke pouring from the ruins, flames licking through the skeletal framework of the glass hall. People gathered on the cliffs and beaches to watch the old landmark burn, the same way they had gathered for entertainments and concerts decades earlier. Only this time, the show was the end. Some said it was arson, plain and simple. Theories pointed to developers eager to clear the land faster and cheaper, or to collect insurance money on a damaged structure. Others suspected vagrants or trespassing teenagers, someone sneaking in for a thrill, lighting a fire for warmth or mischief, and then losing control. A few floated darker ideas involving grudges, cover-ups of accidents on site, or an attempt to erase evidence of something that had happened in those last weeks of access. What we know is that the blaze moved incredibly fast. Old, dry wooden elements of the structure, saturated over decades with salt and chemicals, burned like kindling. The glass roof shattered and collapsed, steel warped and fell. By the time firefighters had control, the baths as a building were effectively gone. What remained were the concrete pools, foundations, and some supporting walls, tough, low structures that fire couldn't really consume. In a way, the fire completed a transformation already underway. The baths had been slowly shifting from living place to memory. The fire just made it literal. stripping away the last of the surfaces and decorations, leaving behind a skeleton that time and weather would go on polishing. If the story ended right there, it would already be bittersweet and a bit sinister. A grand public pleasure palace built by a self-made millionaire, opened with utopian intent, slowly strangled by economics and changing tastes, and finally erased by flame under circumstances everyone seems to find at least a little fishy. But the story doesn't really end with the fire. It spills over into what you see if you go there today. After the blaze, plans for those high-rise apartments and other developments bounced around, but momentum shifted. The tide of history was moving in favor of saving open spaces and historic sites. The idea that the entire edge of San Francisco should be carved up into private luxury housing began to feel a little too crass, even for a city no stranger to ruthless real estate deals. Slowly, the land around the ruins, including the bath site, came into public hands and was incorporated into what would become the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Instead of being paved over and built up, the foundations and pools were left as they were, a ruin by the sea. Paths and stairways were added so that visitors could walk down safely. Over time, signage went up, photos of how the baths had looked in their heyday, brief descriptions of their history, warnings about the danger of rogue waves and unstable structures. Walk among those ruins now, and the ghosts are loud if you listen. The lower basins fill with seawater at high tide, just as they did when the baths were alive. But now they're home to seaweed and crabs instead of paying customers. Kids hop from stone to stone while their parents call warnings. Couples sit on old walls, legs swinging, talking about everything and nothing while waves crash just beyond. If you find your way to some of the tunnel entrances carved beneath the cliffs, the air turns colder. The sound of the ocean changes. It goes from a roar to a heartbeat, a deep, slow thump against stone. These tunnels used to serve the waterworks of the baths, part industrial, part magical. Today, they're the kind of place that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, even if you don't believe in ghosts at all. Maybe it's just the knowledge that workers sweated and struggled down here, that every system has a hidden human cost. On foggy days, the ruins feel older than they are, like something out of a forgotten civilization. Not Roman, not Greek, but distinctly coastal Californian, born of the 19th century belief that technology could bend nature into any shape asked of it. If you squint, you can almost see the glass arching overhead again, the sound of a band tuning up in the distance, the splash of a practiced diver hitting the water cleanly. But the darker layers of the story are there too, under the nostalgia. The workers injured in boiler rooms, the drownings, the kids lost, the people who might have found in those high platforms in deep water a place to end their lives rather than just escape them for an afternoon. The uneasy way, class and race carved lines even within this supposedly democratic playground. And at the end, the fire that turned a failing business into a blackened insurance case overnight. There's something about a ruin that invites us to romanticize. We stand on broken steps and think, what a shame, what a loss. And yes, in many ways, the loss of the Sutro Baths as a functioning public facility is exactly that, a loss. Imagine if San Francisco still had a truly grand public swimming palace on the ocean, renovated, updated, but still honoring the mad vision that built the original. But it's also healthy to remember that at its height, the baths were never pure magic. They were a business. They were a machine that consumed fuel, money, and human labor at a ferocious rate. They had rules and exclusions and blind spots. In the bright reflection off the pool water, a lot of these shadows faded from view. That's part of why the story feels dark when we go back and look properly. We're filling in the gaps that the old brochures left out. The story of the Sutro Baths is, in a way, the story of San Francisco in miniature. An immigrant with a big idea wins a fortune in a risky venture, pours that money into bigger dreams, clashes with monopolies, becomes a folk hero. A grand public project rises, promising access, equality, and delight. For a while, it delivers. Then economics shift, technology moves on, and the very things that made the project special become what makes it expensive and fragile. Eventually, land itself becomes more valuable than whatever sits on it. Fire, literal or metaphorical, clears the way for the next thing. If you've ever wondered whether a city can have a memory, This place is as good a place as any to ask the question. The baths are gone, but the name persists. Old photos circulate online and in books, showing scenes that feel almost unreal. Bathers in modest one-piece suits waiting in crowded pools beneath a towering glass roof, the Pacific visible through windows at the far end. People point at those images and say, "I can't believe that was really here." And yet, when you stand among the broken walls and look out at the ocean, it becomes easier to believe. You can see how the shape of the land dictates the structure that once sat on it. You can trace the edges of the former pools, the outlines of the old platforms. The ruins anchor the story in reality. This isn't just a legend about a lost palace. It was concrete, steel, glass, steam, sweat, money, and lives. So if you ever find yourself there, standing near the edge where the safe path ends and the dangerous rocks begin, take a moment. Let the cold wind bite into your cheeks. Listen to the waves. Look down into those basins filling and emptying with the tide. And imagine, just over your shoulder, the ghost of Adolph Sutro himself, staring out at the water with that peculiar mix of arrogance and idealism that defined him. He wanted to trap the ocean, to package it, to sell it cheaply enough that almost anyone could buy a piece of the experience. In the process, he built one of the most outrageous bathhouses the world has ever seen, a place where Victorian sensibilities, industrial age engineering, and raw Pacific power collided in a wild, noisy experiment. It dazzled, it thrilled, it injured. It cost more than it could ever really earn. And in the end, it burned. We like to think we're different now, smarter, more careful with our monuments and our money. But if you squint a little, you can see the outlines of the same pattern repeating in other places, other grand projects that seem too big to fail until they do. The Sutro Baths are just an early dramatic example of a cycle that cities all over the world have repeated. Build big, build bold, forget to budget for decay, and then, when the numbers stop adding up, reach for the match or the wrecking ball. The ruins on that San Francisco cliff are, in the end, a kind of warning as much as they are a romantic photo backdrop. They're what's left when the music stops and the crowd goes home for the last time. They're what remains when the story of a place is no longer about tickets sold, but about memories carried. And they're waiting, in their damp, sea-sprayed quiet, for people like you to walk among them and ask the questions the ruins deserve. Who built this? Who paid for it? Who was welcome here and who wasn't? Who got rich and who got hurt? What was promised and what was delivered? Because in those questions, more than in the statistics about pool sizes or attendance numbers, you find the real heart of the dark story of San Francisco's most outrageous bathhouses. A story that begins in ambition, passes through glory, and ends in fire and salt water, with the Pacific still pounding the shore exactly as it did before any of it existed, and as it will long after all of us are gone. If you listen closely, standing there in the wind, you might almost hear the echoes, a splash, a cheer, a whistle, the distant strains of a brass band fighting with the roar of the sea. For a moment, the glass roof is back, the lights are on, and the baths are alive again. And then a wave hits the rocks, hard, spraying cold mist into your face, and the illusion breaks. You're back in the present, among ruins. But now you know what those ruins used to be. And once you know, it's impossible to see them as just cracked concrete and rusted rails ever again.